since since this is the exciting, though a bit chaotic, 200th episode of the show, I thought it would be, given the most recent comments, it would be nice to get a little bit meta. And given, Dan, your comments on panpsychism, as you said, it's kind of just like a slogan. Philosophy is a lot about slogan making. Nothing follows from it. I thought I ought to ask about the two of your views on philosophy, just more generally. And Dan, it seems like you think of philosophy quite broadly as continuous, but and maybe separate from the sciences, but maybe continuous and separate just are actually antonyms. But how do you see the relationship between science and philosophy?
Well, different from the way a lot of philosophers see it. I see philosophy at its best as an arena of thinking where, in one sense, anything goes. But it's only useful if what goes is part of an inquiry that's already going on and that has lots of facts. So I've said, without embarrassment, I think philosophers are better at questions than answers. And I love it when I can meet with scientists and think that I am helping them shape their questions better and cast off some assumptions that they hadn't realized that they were making. That's, I think, a good role for philosophers. My favorite definition of philosophy is Wilfrid Sellars, which is that philosophy is, I want to get it word for word if I can, about how things, in the widest sense of the term, hang together, in the widest sense of the term. Now that seems almost trivial, but let me give you a small sample of the things there are in the widest sense of the term. There's atoms and molecules and the fields and gravity and cells and molecules and voices and democracies and words and pictures and voices and minds and baseball games and home runs and money. What's money made out of? What are baseball games made of? What's democracy made of? These are things in the widest sense of the term. And some of them are just as real, just as important, more important maybe, than the things of physics. The old, it's all atoms in the void, that simplification. Well, if that's your ontology, if that's the kind of only kind of things that you tolerate, you got big problems, because there's lots of things in the world that then you have to declare to be illusory. So for me, philosophy looks pre-theoretically at the candidates for thinghood and decides which ones to take seriously and what follows from the fact that we're taking them seriously.
This description of philosophy as an arena where anything goes, modulo some restrictions, reminds me of a conversation that I had with the philosopher Michael Strevens at NYU about what science is. And he seemed to think of science as an arena where anything goes, but there are some restrictions. And the most important restriction is that one has to reason around evidence that is available for everybody to potentially reproduce or observe. And this immediately brings to mind panpsychism, what we were just talking about, where there is no evidence of this sort, since it's non-physical. But Sean, did you have anything to add to Dan's thoughts on what philosophy
Well, when
is?
you said you were going to start getting meta at the end of the podcast, I thought you were going to encourage Dan to start his own podcast, since, you and I have been very successful here. Like, maybe Dan could become famous if he actually just had a podcast, or maybe Dan and Steve could team up. I don't know. But about philosophy and science, look, I think that they're continuous with each other. I think that most human knowledge is of a continuum, right? I think that physics and philosophy do not have a sharp right line between them. Maybe that's the Darwinian lesson also, but physics and chemistry and biology don't have sharp right lines between them. And biology and psychology and sociology don't have sharp right lines between them. These are categories we invent to make universities. They're not things that are out there in the world. But there are stylistic differences in practice that are absolutely impossible to miss. I mean, Dan is right that philosophers are much better at questions than at answers. If you're a physicist and a philosopher explains to you why you've made a mistake, you should absolutely take them seriously. But if you're a physicist and a philosopher says, here's my theory, you can more or less tune them out. It's very unlikely that that's going to be helpful. And I think that, the stylistic differences, the fact that we have reified these differences in academia is a bigger problem than we let on. I'm very, very privileged right now at Johns Hopkins to have this position where I can do both physics and philosophy and call it natural philosophy. And since I've arrived, I've been getting a lot of emails from undergraduates or high school students saying, how can I do that? That's what I want to do. I want to ask these big questions about the nature of reality, but take science seriously, blah, 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 blah. And I have to be honest. I have to say, look, in the real world, if you want to become a professor and do these things for a living, you have to get a PhD in either physics or philosophy. And those two processes are utterly different. The required courses are different. What you have to learn is different. There is no in between. And you have to make that choice. And that's too bad. Once you make that choice, and while you're in that on that path, you can try to become good enough in your specific field to get a job, and then you can broaden out your actual interests. And that's fine, but we don't give nearly enough encouragement or opportunity to people who want to do these things. And I think that our intellectual life suffers because of that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think, though, that doing what you'd like to do to encourage that has its risks too. There's a certain sort of curse of interdisciplinarity that leads to facile oversimplification and faddishness. And last thing I would ever want to be is the Dean of Interdisciplinary Studies. But I'm all for interdisciplinary study, but I don't want to institutionalize it like that.
Well, the Santa Fe Institute, though, is a terrific example.
Lovely example.
Where it's done right. I spoke with, I know you probably know him very well, Jeffrey West, about his work. He's a string theorist, a physicist, and he's
absolutely not a string theorist, by the way.
Well, he's done string theory, I think.
Supersymmetry, he did. Supersymmetry and high energy physics, yes. But these little differences matter. The narcissism of small differences is very much
I'm pretty sure, though, that he did say that he was working on string theory. I could be totally wrong. We'll check. I'll email you. I'm curious now.
Maybe it's a new interest of Jeffrey's. He's a...
he's probably said supersymmetry.
Okay. But he has done also, of course, this very interesting work in biology, complexity theory, scaling of cities.
Scale is a wonderful book.
Yeah. By the way, at Hopkins in our Natural Philosophy Forum, which Janan Ismail and I have founded, every year we have a distinguished lecturer. And last year our lecturer was Dan Dennett, and this year our lecturer is Jeffrey West.
Oh, I've got great company on the show then. That's great. Well then, one thought about the continuity of science and philosophy. I asked this question to a professor here at Stanford. His name is Nadim Hussain, but he pointed out to me that a lot of the special sciences started with philosophy. So with Aristotle, I mean, Aristotle, I think, was the first biologist in a sense. I recently learned, I've probably mentioned it a number of times, that he was the person who discovered that dolphins aren't fish. But once and Dan, you said that philosophers are better at questions than answers. What seems to be the case is that, or one thing that has been the case historically, is that philosophers have clarified the questions and the concepts, and then once there's an agreed upon methodology for answering or thinking about these questions, they get doled out to the special sciences. But of course, philosophy is still very important when it's done well and involved in those sciences, continuing to clarify the questions.
Yeah, well, there's fossil evidence of that. The American Philosophical Society is a scientific society. It's not philosophers at all, really. It started out that way. So, yeah, philosophy, when it gets questions straight enough to be answered, turns them over to others. But if you look at the history of philosophy, you will see that many of the best philosophers have been scientists themselves. I mean, Descartes, Leibniz, for that matter.
The best philosophers of math.
Yeah, right. Aristotle himself. So as Sean says, the line between philosophy and science has always been not a drawable line. There's been a joint which has had much traffic going in both directions.
Yeah, I mean, there's a joke that once philosophy starts making progress in some area, you stop calling that area philosophy anymore. You give it a different name and remove it to a different department. But
not for nothing is the psychology department at Harvard in William James Hull.
Famous example of a natural philosopher, right?
Who was a professor of philosophy. Yeah, but they rightly named the psychology building after him. Yes.
I have often said that you can't not do philosophy as a scientist. You can only do it badly, or you can only not be aware that you're doing it. But in most science, you can do it badly and you get away with it fine. It's just not necessary, right? If you're doing a certain integral or calculating a certain reaction rate, who cares about the philosophy behind it? I think that the relevant fact is that there are always these subsets of science, whether it's biology or physics or psychology or whatever, where the philosophical issues are front and center. The example I like to use, because it's not the most famous one or the one that people think of, is we built a Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, right? A giant particle accelerator that cost $9 billion and has cost more money since then. And, for good reasons, but one of the biggest single reasons, one of the biggest single motivations for doing that, besides, it's something else to do, was that we had what is called the naturalness problem in physics. We thought that there had to be something called the Higgs boson, and the Higgs boson had to have a certain mass approximately, and that mass is way lower than we expected. So part of the motivation, the justification for spending $9 billion on the Large Hadron Collider was to find the Higgs, but an even bigger part of it was to find all of the other new physics that would help us account for the naturalness problem. And number one, we haven't found anything beyond the Higgs boson. We were wrong in our expectations. And number two, whether a theory of physics is natural or not is very obviously a philosophy question. And the philosophers haven't faced up to this one, frankly. Neither the physicists nor the philosophers have really thought deeply about what is meant by these questions, even though we spend literally billions of dollars being motivated by them. So I think there's lots of room for being more serious about the overlap between science and philosophy.